Hey everyone, today I'm going to be doing part 2 of my August wrap-up, which will be covering everything that I read for the POC-a-thon, which was a fun read-a-thon that I participated in last week, where you basically try to read books about diverse characters by authors from a variety of different backgrounds. So I had a lot of fun participating in this read-a-thon. I made a kind of giant 15-book TBR as some options that I would pull throughout the week, and I'm happy to say that I did pretty well with this readathon, and I was able to make it through 9 books. So, not working definitely played a big factor in that, so thank you, summer vacation. But it was really one of the best reading weeks that I've had so far this summer, so I cannot wait to talk to you about these books. So I'm going to go through them in order of the 5 prompts for this readathon, and then I will have a few extra bonus picks that I'll mention at the end. The first prompt is to read books with main characters from at least 3 different races and ethnicities, and Scarborough by Katherine Hernandez was the perfect book for this challenge, since it does not have just one main character. It's really a multi-voiced novel from various different narrative perspectives. Just thinking off the top of my head, there were characters in this book who were First Nations, Filipino, Black, European, and Middle Eastern, so really it covered a lot of different perspectives, which I thought really reflected the diversity that you would find in a lot of neighborhoods in Toronto. Most of the characters in this novel are connected through a literacy center, but it's really, of course, not just about what these kids are learning, but it's this sense of community that this center is able to foster, and the relationships that both the parents and students and educators themselves are able to form, so it really makes you see how important these outreach programs are, especially in these low-income neighborhoods with these at-risk students. Of course, important programs like these rely often on government funding, and there are some really amusing back-and-forth exchanges included in this book between the educator working at the center and the ministry that requires certain data from her and encourages her to do things that she doesn't always agree with, and you can see the difficulties that the educator has in this book as she realizes that the relationships that she builds with her students are the most important aspect of her job, but that's also the aspect that's really difficult for her. So when tragic things happen, it's hard to just shut off these connections and to just be a cold, calculated professional, which is sort of what the ministry and the program wants from her. So there's a very interesting contrast there. So I have to say I really enjoyed this novel. It was quite quick to flip through since you're always switching perspectives. I'm glad I picked this one up because it was a unique portrayal to Toronto than what I'm used to reading in fiction, although I did feel like sometimes Hernandez maybe went a bit overboard in kind of playing how ghetto Scarborough is or how dangerous. Like, it sounded sometimes like you would be reading about Compton or Harlem, where it was just like, yep, just another day in Scarborough. So I'm not quite sure if the city is always quite as gritty and intense as she makes it out to be, but I can still appreciate what she's trying to do here, and she'll definitely be a new voice in Canlit that I will be looking out for whatever she does next. The second prompt was to read a classic by an author of color, and for that one I went with Passing by Nella Larsen, who was a writer associated with the Harlem Renaissance movement, and oh my goodness did I ever enjoy this book. So this is a book about 2 childhood friends who become reacquainted later in their lives, and I just have to say that I really love any book that explores twisted female friendships. So like Sula by Toni Morrison or the Neapolitan novels by Elena Ferrante, I am there for that. And I would also add this book to the list because things get quite complicated between the two since they've gone in such different directions with their lives. So one of them, Claire, seems like she has her life all together. She's married this super rich husband, she travels a lot, she's got this kind of glamorous life, and she's also been passing herself off as a white woman. So even though she has African American heritage, her husband, who happens to be a huge racist, knows nothing about it. Claire finds herself attracted to her friend Irene's life. Irene's life may not be as glamorous, but it's also not a huge lie, so she's able to engage with the African American community. She organizes these fun balls and events, and she knows a lot of cool, creative, artistic people, and Claire is really attracted to this life, and she's going to try to insert herself there, and of course, it just gets gets twisted and tense. Like, this was a really intense book kind of all the way through. I did have to read it in one day just because, one, I was enjoying it and wanted to know what was going to happen, but also, two, because I was feeling this sense of anxiety and just needed this story to be resolved. And it is a really interesting ending in this book. Quite ambiguous. It's a book that I know that I'm gonna have to reread hopefully sometime soon, because there are just so many different layers to the story, so many different ways to read what's happening. It's a bit of an unreliable narrator situation, so this was just such a good book. I think there's going to be a film adaptation too, so all the more reason to check it out. So this is one I'm definitely going to be revisiting, but so glad I checked it out this week. Prompt 3 is to read a science fiction or fantasy book by or featuring people of color. For this one, I went with Kinship, which is the first book in the Way of Thorn and Thunder, an indigenous fantasy epic trilogy by Daniel Heath Justice. So this book really delivered exactly what it set out to do. This was going to be some epic fantasy. So yeah, like, there are maps and like a full glossary at the end. Like, you are immersed into this world, and basically the big conflict in this story is European colonization, essentially. So there are a bunch of characters who would represent the indigenous First Nations who were living in North America, and then the men in this story are, of course, the Europeans encroaching on their land. So it's kind of interesting to see this historical challenge taking place in this fantasy realm, and it's almost like this alternate depiction of history where these people decide to band together and fight against the man. I mean, this is something that I'm just there for. It did take me quite a while to get immersed in this story. It was a bit slow going for me at first, but once it picked up and I saw where it was going, I gotta say I was getting into it. This first book has very like Council of Elrond vibe, where the characters are all like meeting up together and deciding what they're gonna do. So it was a pretty cool introduction to the series, and I do think that I'll be continuing on with book 2 sometime soon, because I do want to know what's gonna happen next. Prompt number 4 was to read a poetry collection by an author of color. I was able to get around to 2. The first one was There Are More Beautiful Things Than Beyonce by Morgan Parker. This was just a pretty cool collection of poems, often addressing a certain Black female experience, and sort of dealt with like struggles of everyday life and mental health and what you want to achieve in your life, sort of. So it is partly about Beyonce, so ask yourselves, do you want to read about Beyonce, or are you the type of person that doesn't want pop culture in your poetry? Personally, I thought it was cool, and I liked checking this collection out. And then I also read A Place Called No Homeland by Cheng Thom. Kai was just an impressive storyteller, and these poems seemed deeply personal and addressed a lot of facets of the poet's own identity, so her own feelings as someone with Chinese heritage living in Canada, facing racism and discrimination. She also writes about queerness and gender identity, and how the LGBTQ plus community is not always as welcoming and inclusive as it might appear to be on the surface. So definitely a provocative, intriguing, and challenging collection of poetry. These are difficult poems that deal with violence and trauma and struggle, but yet there is also a very uplifting quality to a lot of them that is kind of about the beauty of resilience and survival. So really glad I checked this collection out, and again, it's another Canadian author that I will be watching and looking out for more in the future. The final prompt was to read a book about racism, prejudice, or immigration, and I picked Americanah by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and this book was just perfect for that since it dealt with all 3 of those themes, since it is about a girl, Ifemelu, who leaves Nigeria to go to school in America, and basically she discovers race. So where race did not play a large part of her life while she was living in Nigeria, she realizes that being African in America is actually something that's very charged. So she becomes quite fascinated in the topic of race and starts writing a blog about the subject. So I really enjoyed the blog posts that were included. They were quite witty and irreverent, and she talks about her experiences not as an African American, but as an American African, and how that experience is kind of different. So there were just a lot of observations in this book that I just really enjoyed reading about. I always love reading about immigration, to take a place that you're kind of familiar with and see it through just completely different eyes, where so many things that you take for granted are all of a sudden kind of exotic or different. Like, there is a heartbreaking scene in this where Ifemelu's parents come and they want her to take their picture in front of JCPenney, and they want to make sure that the full logo gets in the picture. And, you know, someone from here, you think JCPenney, not really that cool and exciting, but to these parents, it was just like a landmark that they wanted to be captured. So moments like that I just loved reading about. It also really captures the struggle and the alienation. The scenes in here where Ifemelu is running out of money, having a hard time getting a job, and facing depression, I thought were just so accurately depicted. So this book does a good job of covering all these different emotions that someone can go through, these low points, these high points, and everything in between. So this story covers Ifemelu's time in America and also her decision to return home. But of course, returning home to Nigeria, it can never be the same as before she left it. And it also explores the experience of her ex-boyfriend who moves to England as an undocumented immigrant and all of the anxieties that come along with that status. So there are a lot of different moving parts in this book. This book is marketed as a love story, and that really wasn't the most compelling aspect of this book to me. I can't really say that the ending was all that powerful, but almost every other moment in this book was just so entertaining. And this book is just so well constructed, and it's so effortless to read. Like, it was just enjoyable. Every single page. I loved the writing, I loved the dialogue, the characters. Now, I can't say that this novel has the same intensity or impact as her second novel, Half of a Yellow Sun, but this novel is definitely more entertaining, and it's still a really great character study with a lot of great writing. So I really enjoyed reading this, and I cannot wait for her to come out with a new novel because I am all caught up at this point. So those were the books that I read last week that best fit the 5 prompts of the readathon, but I did also have time to get to an additional 3 books, so I will quickly mention them here for you. One of them was If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin. This is a heartbreaking story of a young couple who are just trying to start their lives off together until the boyfriend in this situation, Fonny, gets falsely accused of committing a crime, and he gets imprisoned, and it is going to be one heck of a difficult attempt to try to release him from the system. It's just a really sad story. You know, you really want to root for this young couple. You see just how difficult it can be to find love in this world and to just have a happy life when there is so much systemic oppression. So this was just a sad book, and what also made it sadder is how relevant it is. You know, it was written quite a while ago, but this kind of story of prejudice and police brutality is still quite relevant to today. And this was a book that I read pretty much in one sitting while I was at an airport and on an airplane, so it was just like a strange experience of just not being able to put this book down. It was so compelling and well put together. So I think I would like to revisit it, but to like take my time with it a little more. But I will always have kind of fond memories of just getting really lost in this story up in the sky. The next book that I have is a really fun one, and that was A Rage in Harlem by Chester Himes. So I don't really read a lot of crime fiction, but I'm thinking that I should change this because this book was an absolute blast. And the interesting thing is Charles Himes wasn't actually interested really in writing crime. He wanted to be more of a literary fiction author, but he moved to Europe and someone ended up commissioning him to write these crime novels set in Harlem. And since he was writing for a European audience, he kind of exaggerated things and sensationalized Harlem in a way that it's just like a lot of fun to read about. The plot in this book is pretty outrageous, and it's got a very fun cast of characters. You've got this kind of innocent, naive guy who works at a funeral home and gets completely conned by these criminals, and then he teams up with his brother, who is this drug user that dresses up like a nun to scam people from their money. So they were a really great team. I found this book thrilling and satisfying as a piece of crime fiction, but I also just loved the writing in this book. It was just so interesting and hilarious. I was really laughing out loud at a lot of points, especially when he's trying to depict how extra and ridiculous Harlem is. So here's one of my favorite passages. Black and white folks rubbed shoulders day and night over the beer-wet bars, getting red-eyed and rambunctious from the ruckus juice and fist-fighting in the streets between the passing cars. They sat side by side in the neon glare of the food factories, eating things from the steam tables that had no resemblance to food. Whores buzzed about the area like green flies over stewing chitterlings. There were so many passages in this book that were just delightful and weird, and this was just honestly so much fun that I'm going to be going online and trying to scoop up all the Chesterheims that I can find because I love this book. The last book I have to talk about is a delightful graphic novel called This One Summer by Mariko and Jillian Tamaki. I was lucky enough to read this book in one sitting. It was a perfect way to spend an evening out on my balcony flipping through the gorgeous artwork of this story. It's about two girls who are childhood friends. Their families have both been going up to cottages and they have been spending their summers together, but they're starting to get older. You know, they're approaching this weird age of adolescence where they're starting to change and move apart in different directions. And I thought it really captured how when you are at that preteen age and you become a little obsessed with teenagers and like they want to be perceived as cool by these teenagers, and it just kind of shows how like they're starting to be a part of this older world, but they don't quite have access to the tools that they need to understand what's going on around them. So one of the girls is noticing there's a lot of tension between the adults in her family. She doesn't quite know what's going on with her parents, and then her and her friend also become very fascinated with some drama going on with teenagers who work and hang out at this general store. It's just a really charming book. Like, there's really not too much that's going on, but it just really is a perfect depiction of this time of life. It was just a really beautiful, well put together graphic novel that really captured this experience. So really glad that I checked this one out. So those were the books that I was able to read for the POC-a-thon. Thank you so much for sticking through with me in this long wrap-up. And also thank you to the creators of the POC-a-thon, because this really inspired me to pick up some books that I had been meaning to read, and I had such a great time participating in this readathon. Please let me know down below if you've got thoughts about any of these books, and also let me know if you participated in the POC-a-thon and read anything good last week. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you again later.